Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be learning together again. This class is part of Drisha Spring Zman, discussions on the Parashah, this week Shemini with Rabbanit Leah Sarna. I think all of you know Rabbanit Leah Sarna, who is a member of the faculty and the director of team programs at Drisha. And just a couple reminders to keep yourself muted when you're not actively speaking. I will also help mute when you forget, and just remember to unmute whenever you would like to make a comment or ask a question. You can also write comments and questions here in the chat if you're with us on Zoom, or you can make a comment on Facebook if you're watching us on Facebook Live. Hello to you as well. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbanit Sarna.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Great to be learning the Parsha with you all again. So these programs are actually called like discussions on the Parsha. So if anyone has thoughts and wants to jump in, I really, really, really welcome it. I'm going to be sharing my screen. So if you, it's very difficult to see if people like raise their hands or anything like that while you're in that mode. So just jump in, just like interrupt me, or you can put something in the chat and ask Evie to interrupt me. And that's what we'll do. Before I do that, just a word on Parshat Shemini. So here's what's happening in the world of the Torah. So the Mishkan was built at the end of Sefer Shmot, and then we learned all about all the different sacrifices that are going to be brought in that Mishkan in Parshat Vayikra. And at the end of Parshat Tzav, or at the beginning of Parshat Tzav, all the stuff that Moshe learned in Vayikra gets taught over to the Kohanim. And at the end of Parshat Tzav, you start the initiation process, the miluim, which is so interesting. Like, it doesn't mean in the Torah and in rabbinic literature what the word means. Like in modern Hebrew, when we say someone's on miluim, we say that they are in reserves for the military. And in this process, what we mean by miluim is that they're being initiated. So their initiation process, both for the Mishkan itself as an initiation process, but really even more so for the Kohanim, their initiation process then lasts 7 days, and they're like quarantined basically in to the, I thought I froze there for a second. Okay, they're quarantined into the Mishkan, and Shmini starts out on the 8th day. So they had 7 days of quarantine, and now it is the 8th day, and everything is supposed to like start working. Kvod Hashem comes down. Fire, this is very important. Fire comes down and consumes the offering that is brought. And then we meet Nadav and Avihu. And Nadav and Avihu bring an Eish Zarah. They bring a fire that's not the fire that Hashem sent down. They bring their own fire. Maybe they didn't know what they were supposed to do, or the Midrash, the preponderance of Midrashim assume that they were drunk, potentially, that they were like so celebrating all this new stuff that was happening that they were not, they were under the influence, and they brought in Ish Sarah, and Hashem kills them. So that's what we're up to. And I'm going to start sharing my screen, and then we'll talk about what it is that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to start here, and I'll go back in a second. So Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Ish Machtato. So Aaron's son, Nadav, and Avihu each take their ketoret shovel, their sensor. They nubahan ish, v'yasimu aleh ketoret. They put fire on it. They put incense on the fire. V'yakrivu lifnei Hashem ish zara asher lo tzivah otam. And they offered this foreign fire before Hashem, which was not commanded of them. So remember, right? Like, we have so much commandment. All of Parashat Vayikra gets told all over again in Parashat Tzav. And then they're in the Mishkan 7 days. They don't even leave. And nevertheless, they do this thing that they were not commanded. Asher lo tzivah otam. Okay, but teitzei eish milifnei Hashem v'tuchal otam, and fire comes out from the presence of the Lord and consumes them. Vayamutu lifnei Hashem, and they die before the Lord. Vayomer Moshe el Aharon, and Moshe says to Aaron, Hu asher diber Hashem lemor bekrovai ekadesh. This is what God meant when he said, those who are near me, I will show myself holy. Va'al pnei kol ha'am ekaved, and before all the people, I will be glorified. So Moshe basically says, I mean, there's a million different ways to interpret that line, but Moshe basically says to Aaron, like, you guys were warned. Your job is serious. In order to be made holy in front of this people and to be made dignified and honored in front of these people and glorified, you have to do what I tell you to do and not go rogue and not do your own stuff. And if you're the holy people who are the facilitators of these holy things that we're doing, then you have a high stakes job. You have a high stakes job, and if you do it right, that's amazing, and you get all the honor and all the glory. And if you do it wrong, then you will die. So that's the learning in Nadav Avihu. Our Moshe basically says to Aaron, like, I told you, you guys were warned. Vayidom Aaron, and Aaron was silent. So today what we're going to talk about is the silence. We're going to talk about how the silence gets carried down into Hilchot Avelut specifically. Because silence, I'm going to stop sharing my screen again for 1 second. Silence is kind of complicated today. So we think about silence in the face of tragedy in our lives right now, and we say, oh, like if you're silent and you're not speaking out about something that happened, then you're complicit. And we have good Jewish language for that, right? Like shtika kahoda or whatever. Like to be silent is to agree or to be complicit. So in our culture today, we always say, no, like you have to speak up. You must use your voice. And Aaron is silent. Aaron sees, experiences tragedy, and instead, and he does eventually use his voice later, but in this moment, he is silent. And that silence is seen as a model. It gets taken to be a model for one of the ways that Jews can respond to tragedy, and particularly one of the ways that we respond to very personal tragedy. And I think at the end we'll come back around to like, when is it appropriate to be silent and when is it inappropriate or like mandatory to actually raise up your voice and use it. But I think we live in a culture that's just so obsessed with noise that we forget that it's okay to be silent, or in the Jewish tradition and the halachic tradition, it's even mandated to be silent, and that there's an important space for silence that Aaron is the first one to model here in our Parsha, but then we are supposed to walk in the ways of that modeling whenever we experience grief also. And I want to share with you a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and she grew up in a very religious home, not a Jewish home, a Christian home. But this poem, we can go back to this poem at the end, but this poem is very critical of certain types of expressions of grief, and very much in favor of silence. So we'll just read it now and then we'll come back to it again later. But I like to like kind of frame this with her words. So she says, I tell you, hopeless grief is passionless, that only men incredulous of despair, half taught in anguish, through the midnight air beat upward to God's throne in loud access of shrieking reproach. Full desertness in souls as countries lieth silent bare under the blenching vertical eye glare of the absolute heavens. Deep-hearted man, express grief for thy death in silence like to death, most like a monument statue set in everlasting watch and moveless woe, till itself crumble to the dust beneath. Touch it. The marble eyelids are not wet. If it could weep, it could arise and go. Okay, we'll come back to it after we've excavated a little bit more about silence. Okay, so I'm going to lay out 4 different ways of thinking about why silence might be mandatory Um, and then we'll come back to Elizabeth Barrett Browning at the end. Okay, so the first option is that silence is forcing someone into sadness. Like you might be, let's say you're our own in this moment, your son's just died, but like you're busy. There's a lot happening. It's possibly like the best day of your life, you know? Like finally you're not like fighting anyone. You just get to be a Kohen and serve the people in this like really super glorified, special way. You have this whole fancy new outfit. And it's all finally come together and all this work and all these freed people who like you knew and were in, you were there with them when they were all slaves, and now all of a sudden they're artisans and made this amazing thing, and you're gonna lead them in the creation of a new beautiful type of spirituality that's so uniquely theirs and outside of the oppressive kind of thumb of Egypt. um and two of your sons are killed. And maybe you're just like, I'm not letting this get me down. Like this can get me down tomorrow, like maybe another time, you know? And instead, when he's silent, that's a way of actually making the space for sadness, bringing the sadness in. And so when we think about why an Avel has to be silent, or we'll get to like what is actually the halacha of the Avel silence, we we can think about it as a way of them making space for sadness. So here's the Gemara in Moed Katan 15a. Aval asur b'she'ilat shalom. A mourner is prohibited in greetings. The ka'amar le'rachamana li'yechazkel ha'anik dom, because God says to Yechazkel, sigh in silence. Okay, so here's where those verses are from in Yechezkel. Yidvar Hashem Eli Lemor Ben Adam Hineni Lokeach Bimcha Et Machamadi Nacha B'Magefa. So the word of the Lord came to me, mortal, with one blow I'm about to take from you the delight of your eyes. Velo tispo, velo tivka, velo tavodi matacha. But you're not allowed to mourn or weep. Tears should not run down your eyes. Hanik dom metim. Avalot asa, right, sorry. Hanek dom metim evel lo ta'aseh, percha chavosh alacha una alacha tasim baraglacha, velo ta'atal safam, velacha manashim lo tochel. So sigh but not allowed, and make no mourning for the dead. Bind up your turban, put on your sandals, don't cover your upper lip, and don't eat the bread of mourners. V'adaber la'am b'boker v'tamot ishti ba'arev v'a'as b'boker kasher tu beiti. So says Yechazkel, I spoke to people in the morning. In the evening, my wife died, and the next morning, I did what God commanded of me. And so these words in Yechazkel are confusing because it seems like God says to Yechazkel, a terrible thing's going to happen to you, i.e., the love of your life, your wife is going to die. Don't mourn. And then in Hilchot, and one of the things that Yechezkel does, is commanded to do as not mourning, is He'anek dom, and we're gonna get to what that language is, but this translation says sigh but not allowed, He'anek dom. And so you might think that He'anek dom is something that Yechezkel has to do, and a normal mourner therefore should do the opposite of, the same way as all these other things, right? Yechezkel has to wear his turban, a normal Yechezkel, let's say, has to wear his shoes. The turban thing is confusing. Yechezkel has to wear his shoes. He's not allowed to eat morning foods. So mourners do eat morning foods, and mourners don't wear normal shoes. All that type of thing. But you'll also notice in that it's all mixed in together. The Parashah points this out on the tour here, that it's confusing, and that some of these things we in the Gemara, exactly where we just saw Moed Katan 15a, some of these things we'll look at and we'll say, oh, this is what all mourners should do. Some of these things we'll look at and we'll say, oh, this is what no mourner should do. So this is generally like a quite confusing sort of text, but I'm actually interested in it less for the like, why does the Gemara learn things out in opposite directions from here, and more in just what is this language of a Hanek dome. So when the Gemara says Avel asur b'she'ilat shalom, mourner is prohibited in salutations, the Ka'amar le'rachmana Yechezkel Hanek dome, So because it's what the merciful one said, sigh in silence. What does that mean? Like, what is that phrase, sigh in silence? So just to go here to Rashi and then to Jastrow here also, Hi'anik. Rashi says, hitmakmik b'shtika, be crushed, translates Jastrow of hitmakmik, to be crushed in silence. The silence that you're experiencing should be this sort of like crushing, like almost like pressing, oppressive, maybe silence. That like when you are being silent, we're like pushing you down into sadness. That the silence is actually making space for sadness. And we see that get carried out, I would say basically halachically almost in the Shulchan Aruch here. So the Shulchan Aruch says, Avel asur besimcha, a mourner is not allowed to be happy. Lefichach lo yikach tinok becheko kol sheva, therefore you shouldn't take a baby on his lap for all of Sheva, Shema yavo lidei schok, in case he comes to laugh. So it's not actually about the silence itself in this understanding. It's actually about silence as the opposite of laughter, silence as the opposite of happiness. That when we're happy, we laugh and we make all sorts of happy noises, versus Rashi's language of hitmakmek b'shtika, be crushed by silence. Silence is what makes space for sadness or even represents sadness. So that's option kind of one about what the sadness that's modeled by our own but prescribed to all mourners. Option number one of what it's about is just that the silence makes space for sadness. Okay. Option number two is that silence is actually just about giving someone space to have the emotions that they're having. You're just gonna, this is how we are gonna give you emotional space, give you an opportunity to kind of feel your truth. So when I think about this, I always think about people who don't have Shiva, like Gentiles, don't practice Shiva, who it's like, oh, I buried my spouse or my mom or whatever yesterday, and like now I'm back at work and everyone just thinks like I'm fine and like the world just keeps going, as opposed to Jews who we say like no, like grief needs a container and needs a place to manifest, and you have to be allowed to just like feel whatever it is that you're feeling in your grief. And so silence and the obligation of the obligatory silence is actually about that type of emotional space. So here's a breakdown also from Moed Katan, that I think speaks to that. So Avel Gimel Yamim Rishonim Asur B'Sheilat Shalom. So we have a breakdown in Rabbanan. The mourner for the first 3 days is prohibited in any kind of greetings with other people. And from the third day of Sheva through the seventh day, for the third day of Sheva through the seventh day, if someone says to him Shalom Aleichem, he can respond Aleichem Shalom, but he shouldn't initiate those greetings. And after Sheva, he just goes on his way. And then the Gemara says, hold on, is that true that it's the 3 first days? Vahatanya, don't we have a Breita, Maase Umetu Banav Rabbi Akiva? So we have a story about when the sons of Rabbi Akiva died. Nichnasu Kol Yisrael v'hispidum haspid gadol. And all of Israel came and they had a big eulogy for them. And as they were leaving, and as all of Israel was leaving, Amad Rabbi Akiva al Safsal Gadol, Rabbi Akiva got up on a big bench. Ve'amar Achinu be'Yisrael, says, my brothers, all of Israel, Shim'u, listen up. Afilu shnei banim chatanim menuchamhu bishvil kovod she'asitem v'im bishvil Akiva batem harei kmo Akiva b'shok. Even had my 2 sons been bridegrooms, like if this had been like that's in some ways like the worst kind of like sadness that could have been, I would not have been consoled. I would have been sorry, I would have been consoled on account of the honor you have showed them. If you came to console for the sake of Akiva, then there's lots of Akivas in the Shuk whom Jews don't all come together to console. Ella kach amartem. Rather, this is what you said to yourselves: Torah elokav belibo. The Torah of God is in his heart. V'kol shekein shescharchem kaful l'chulu batechem l'shalom. And how much more so, you came because the Torah of Hashem is in your heart. You wanted to show respect for Torah. All the more so is your reward doubled, for you have consoled mourners. So okay, that's the end of the story. And then Rabbi Akiva, and then the Gemara says, okay, so Rabbi Akiva did extend and initiate even this like big goodbye to all the people who had come to his son's funerals. So it seems like you might say, oh, you are allowed to greet people in the first 3 days. And the answer is no, kvod rabim shani. No, the showing respect for the public is different. Okay, the Gemara continues. So the Gemara quotes again from the Breita, from the 3rd day to the 7th day. You respond when you're greeted, but you don't initiate. And from then onwards, you initiate and respond in a normal way. And then the Gemara raises a challenge or minhu from another Breita. Hamotet chavero avel betoch lamed yom. If you come across your friend who's an avel within the first 30 days of their loss, you speak with them words of comfort, but you don't ask how are they doing. Or you don't ask about their shalom. Let's say better. You don't ask about their shalom. And after 30 days, you do ask about their shalom and you don't speak words of comfort. If a person's wife, if a man's wife died and he's already remarried, then you're not allowed to like come into his house with his new wife and talk about the first wife. But if you find him out and about in the marketplace, amarlo rosh. You can ask him like very, very kind of quietly and sensitively how he's feeling about the loss of his first wife. Amar of Edi Bar, so all of that's like really, really fascinating. I'm just gonna keep going here for a second. Amar of Edi Bar Avin, or Edi Bar Avin said, Hu shoel b'shalom achirim, she'achirim shurim b'shalom. Achirim ein shoelim b'shalomo, shehu eino shurei b'shalom. So this is the part I was pushing forwards to get to. Rabbi Edi Bar Avin says, the mourner himself may extend greetings, shalom, to other people once his shiva is over, because they are shruyim b'shalom. But other people shouldn't ask about him because he is not in a place of peace. Hu eino sharui b'shalom. That's amazing, right? He is not, we'll stop there. He is not in a place of peace. So people shouldn't say Shalom Aleichem to him. So like, what's the point of not saying Shalom Aleichem? We don't say Shalom Aleichem to someone because it's a lie, right? And the Jewish tradition can recognize that you're not in shalom right now. You're not sharui b'shalom right now, and that's okay. And we need to make space for that. And so just to go back to the example of the man whose wife died and then he remarried, maybe for like practical reasons he remarried. He like has little kids. He needs a partner in raising them or something like that. So we have to be honest. Still, okay, Mazel Tov, you got remarried. That's so exciting. And we don't want to be rude to your second wife by always talking about the first wife. And we're still going to recognize that this guy has a loss and we're going to make a space for it. And that's all tied up in the halachic conversation about saying Shalom Aleichem to people. because it's actually still a recognition that this guy, even though he's remarried, is not sharui b'shalom, and in the right time, in the right place, and in the right tone of voice, you can ask him about it, and you can speak to him about it. And this idea that like you're gonna be medaber tanchunim when you meet someone, even after their shiva, because you're just gonna recognize that grief is a real thing that lasts and that needs space and needs a place to go. I'm just looking if there's anything in chat. Okay. That's not what's happening in chat. Okay. And I think we see this kind of playing out in the Shulchan Aruch also. We see this exact language of Rav Idi Bar Avin. So he says, the Shulchan Aruch says, Avel asur b'shelat shalom. And we see that the halachot that were brought in the Breita. So for the first 3 days, for the first 3 days, he's not allowed to say shalom to anyone. And if people see him and they don't know that he's an Avel and they say to him Shalom Aleichem, he should be like, I'm an Avel. Like, that's not appropriate. Shalom is not with me. And then from 3 to 7 days, he doesn't extend a Shalom Aleichem, Eno Shoel, V'machirim lo yad'u shu Avel v'shalu b'shlomo meshiv lahem. But if other people don't know that he's an Avel and they see him and they say Shalom Aleichem, he can just respond. He doesn't have to be like, I can't be there right now, like go away. In a sense, because there's like been a certain amount of healing in those first couple of days, and now you're more in a place, right? When we think about Aaron as this model of silence, that's like an initial silence, right? Like Nadav and Avihu are like literally dead in front of them. And Moshe says something to Aaron and says like more or less like I told you so to Aaron, and Aaron is silent. And that like initial silence, like silence as like that's where we go to first. So in the first version of like what is the silence about, it was about creating that space for sadness. And in this version of it, it's about just acknowledging that it's there and like not lying about it and being honest about it. You're Eno Sharui B'Shalom. Moshe's talking to me. Moshe's talking to me right now. Seriously? This is not what I need right now. And so the silence is almost like in those first 3 days, especially what we just saw described in the Shulchan Aruch, the silence is like, no, like you need to understand who you're talking to and what state I'm in and what's happening right now. And that in a way, Vayidom Aaron, we often think about the Vayidom Aaron, we often think about our own silence as just like I'm not engaging or I'm not responding or I'm not participating. But it's not actually a checking out, right? It's in a way, it's like a response. Like it's like how dare you be talking to me about this right now? Like I'm in Avelis, like I'm in silence right now. And then so that's like that initial way. And then it like lightens up a little bit. And if someone doesn't know, you don't have to yell at them. So that's from days 3 to 7. And from 7 to 30, sho'el b'shalom achirim shem shruim b'shalom. So from 7 to 30 days, you can recognize that other people are in a different place from you, and you can say the word shalom, and you can imagine that that's a state that people can be in while still recognizing that you're not in that state. And so you say shalom aleichem to other people, but other people don't say it back to you. Ein achirim sholim b'shalom. And of course he also responds to people who don't know and the same way that he would from days 3 to 7. And then after 30 days, Harehu Kashar Adam. And so after 30 days, he's like anyone else, but only Bamed Dvarim Mamarim. What are we talking about? Bashar Krovim, with his other relatives, Aval Aviv, or Aval Alav Eva Imo, Sha'al B'Shlomo Acher, Machar Shiva, Ve'in Acherim Sholim B'Shlomo, Ad Achar Yod Chodesh. But really, if you lost your parents, then people shouldn't be saying Shalom Aleichem to you, says the Shulchan Aruch, for a year. They can't ask about your Shalom because you don't have it for a full year. Okay. So right, and this continues with some of the stuff that we saw in the Gemara. I'm just trying to decide if we want to look at it. No, I think we saw this all inside. Okay, so just to summarize kind of part 2 here, option 2 of like, what is this all about? It's all about emotional space. It's about why is someone silent? Because if you're not silent, then you're going to try and like fill it with normal emotions, like the normal greeting, Shalom Aleichem. But what does Shalom Aleichem do? Shalom Aleichem assumes that you're in Shalom. Don't assume that about me. I'm grieving. So therefore, I'm going to have this like big, heavy silence all around me so that you won't assume that about me. If you say Shalom Aleichem to me right after a death, no way I'm responding to that. I'm absolutely not Shalom. After that, I'll respond to you. But just so you know, if you know I'm in Avilos and you said Shalom Aleichem to me, you made the wrong assumption about my life, because I am Eno Sharui V'Shalom. I am not in a place of Shalom. Okay, so that's the emotional space option. Okay, this one is existential space. So it's much more about opening up possibilities for what is God in my life right now. And that the silence is not actually about silence, it's actually about not saying Shalom Aleichem. So that's what we see in the Ramah here. So the Ramah here says, so since you're not allowed to greet people, you're also not allowed to speak too much. We saw this inside, that if it's for the dignity of the masses, like lots of people come to comfort you, then you can say to them, like, go home with shalom, because it's permissible for the dignity of the masses, for the honor of the masses. And then the Ramah says as follows. Okay, all that we've seen. Yish makilin ha'idna b'shelat shalom ha'avel achar lamed. Some people today are much more lenient about greeting the mourner after 30 days. Ve'in tam lahem, and that's not really right. Im lo shichleku lomar shezeh ma she'anu noagim lo mikre shelat shalom shebiyameh. So really, you shouldn't greet people. But if you're gonna greet people, here's the after their solution is over, after 30 days, then like here's the only way you can make sense of it. You can make sense of it if you're gonna say that my greeting, this greeting of hello, good morning, good afternoon, is not Shalom Aleichem. That there's something specific in the language of Shalom Aleichem, that, or in like their She'ilat Shalom that the Gemara is discussing, there's something almost theological there that we don't share today. So what could that be about? So if we look elsewhere, we look in Hilchot Tefillah, because there's another place where you're not allowed to say Shalom Aleichem to other people. And that's actually in the morning, once it's time for Shacharit, then Asur la'adam lahakdim lefatach chavero litain lo shalom. You're not allowed, once it's time for Shacharit, you're not allowed to go to your friend's house and be like, Shalom. Why? Mishum dishmo shal kadosh baruch hu shalom. Because the name of God is Shalom. But you are allowed to say, Aval mutar lomar lo tafra demare tav. And you are allowed to say, good morning, sir. So this idea that the problem with Shalom Aleichem is actually something specific about the word Shalom, that there's a relationship with God implied in the word Shalom, Shalom Aleichem, that maybe poses problems if you're gonna use it when it's already time for tefillah, and you should be like going to davening instead of like talking about God, Shalom Aleichem, but not actually being there. So instead, in the mornings, you should say good morning instead of Shalom Aleichem before Shacharis. But actually, also, what this points to is that the language of Shalom Aleichem, like what we saw in the Ramah, or like what the Ramah doesn't really like it seems like, but what he kind of gestures at is this this understanding of Shalom Aleichem as describing a relationship with the Almighty. And then why would it be inappropriate? We have to ask ourselves, like, why would it be inappropriate? Why is that description inappropriate? It's inappropriate because that's not necessarily a relationship with the Almighty that the mourner has. So in the previous articulation, it was Eno Sharui B'Shalom. Let them feel the way they're feeling. Don't put words into their mouth. Don't greet them, because our greetings always assume some way that people are feeling. How you doing? I'm fine. Good morning. Well, is it a good morning? Maybe it's a bad morning, right? So that was option 1, option 2. But option 3 is actually that the reason for silence is not about silence per se, as much as it is actually something specific in shalom. That she'elat shalom is the language of being prohibited from asking about someone's shalomness, is because the word shalom is Shmo Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is the name of God. And when we're talking about the name of God being shalom, as opposed to, let's say, makom or other specific names of God that we use with mourners, shalom is maybe not representative of our relationship that a mourner has with God, that they're not in peace or in unity or in wholeness with the God that caused this type of rift and loss in their lives. And maybe you can stand back and you can recognize that God is the Dayan Ha'emet, that God is the true judge, but it doesn't mean you have to like the justice or the judgment that was handed down. And so maybe there is a certain type of relationship that has been broken and needs to be fixed, but can only be fixed over time, and don't assume that it's there. And that's why when we say avelim are prohibited in Shelat Shalom, it's actually much less related to our own specific silence and more related to the idea of shalom in general. That's an option. And the last one would be to say that no, it's actually just about silence. What is Hanik Dom? Says the Mitzudat David. The Mitzudat David says Hanik Dom is B'tono Lomar Shtok min ha'anacha v'lo te'anach. Be quiet from your sighing, don't sigh. That there's actually just like an inherent value in the silence itself. Okay, so here's the Rambam. Minayin sha'avel asur b'shelat shalom. How do we know that the mourner is prohibited in greetings? Shena'amar ha'anik dom, because it says, be quiet. Kol it says stop, or hanik dom. I mean, we've seen so many different translations for that now, but we're sticking with the Mitzudat Zavid translation now, which is be quiet from your sighing. Kol shloshayim yimarishonim mishnotin lo shalom in machzir lo. Right, we've seen these already many times. Those first 3 days, anyone who says hello to him doesn't get returned. Elamodi oshu avel. Rather, you say, I'm an avelus, go away. From days 3 to 7, anyone who asks after you, you're allowed to respond. From 7 to 30, Shoel b'shlom achirim, aval achirim ein sholim b'shlomo. He can extend shalom to other people, but they shouldn't respond. They shouldn't ask him. And if he's in avilus for his father or mother, then they shouldn't ask him about his shalom until 12 months. And the Rambam says, here's what it's about. Im b'she'elat shalom na'asar ba'avel kal v'chomer shu asur laharbot dvarim v'lischok shena'amar dom v'lo yachos tinok b'yado shlevi anu lidei schok v'lo yikanis l'makom simcha k'go batem ishto u'kilotira. The Rambam says, if you're not allowed to ask, if you're not allowed to just render a greeting, Shalom Aleichem, good morning, if that's problematic, how much more so is any other talking problematic? Just be quiet. Asur laharbot b'dvarim. And of all those dvarim, how much more so laughter, and any place that's going to bring about laughter. But for Rambam, it's actually just be quiet. There's a value in silence in and of itself. Silence is a characteristic of a mourner. Just be quiet, it seems like, is what the Rambam is saying. And the Shulchan Aruch picks that up as well. Or the Ramah here picks it up. Me'achar she'asur b'shelat shalom kol shekain she'asur laharbot b'dvarim. And we already saw this, but right, once he's prohibited in asking after someone's well-being, how much more so is he prohibited from just like speaking in general? Okay, so just to go back through, right, where we are so far, we have a little bit left to do. But we saw, right, Aaron's sons die. Moshe says to him, more or less, told you so, and Aaron is silent. So maybe what that silence is about is making space for sadness and letting the sadness in, even on such a happy day. It's about letting the sadness in. Maybe it's about just creating emotional space where people stop assuming how you're feeling all the time, or like forcing happiness down your throat. Maybe it's about making space for a rift in a relationship with God. That was the existential space, Mikuro. And the last option is that maybe it's just about silence. That maybe silence is just about silence, and you're not supposed to. It's not about the language of shalom. It's not about relationship. It's not about making space for anything else. It's not silence as a negation or silence as a container. It's just about silence is actually what you do. What you do is you walk in the ways of Aaron, and you are silent, because silence is a characteristic of mourning that we learn from Aaron. Okay, so I wanted to bring you this really beautiful piece by Michael Fishbane from his book of Jewish theology called Sacred Attunement. He says there are two kinds of silence. One of these is natural silence, and it is characterized by the absence of noise. It is a modulation, a diminishment, a negative valence. The other kind of silence is spiritual, and it is characterized by potentiality and anticipation. We sense this every time we watch a conductor or an ensemble gesture slightly, just prior to the production of sound. And we also sense it during moments of self-collection and focus, before something of significance is said to another person. With respect to music, anticipatory silence helps prepare the self to hear sound in, for it focuses attention on the transition from silence to sound. With respect to deliberate speech, silence conveys the ethical potential of words, for it sharpens the transition from inwardness to worldly expression. We didn't see that really anywhere, but I wonder whether you can read that the ethical potential of words into some of what we saw in the halachic literature earlier, the ethical potential of words, maybe into like, this is the value of silence, or maybe it's into that even the like existential space, that if you're gonna, like, if you have a God problem, like, be really, really careful what you say about it, and potentially try and just be quiet in it until it moves forward and you figure it out. Yes, Sandra.
Is that the reason, perhaps, when we're saying Kaddish? I remember many years ago when my mother had passed away, and my sister and I were standing next to each other, and I said to her, and after all the studying, it's never the same as when you're living it. I said, why are we saying these words? Why? And she said, because if we didn't say these prescribed words, we might curse God. And so this is exactly what it seems Michael Fishbane is saying. He's saying it will sharpen the transition into permissive expression, as opposed to what we learned before in 1, 2, and 3, which is angry expression and correct expression. So Vayidom Aharon, of course, he was probably paralyzed, but the point is he did it right. A person could have exploded in anger.
Totally. At God and at Moshe.
Totally. So it was brilliant. And the other thing I was thinking of is that David Silber is always telling us, and we always connect. And the Nachash was original, but of course he keeps coming. And what part of the Nachashness that Adam Harishon expressed was when God said, David also says, when God asks a question, you're in trouble because God already knows the answer. So he's asking the question, run and hide. So when he says to him, what have you done? And he says, I didn't do it. Not only did I not do it, she made me do it. Not only did the woman make me do it, but you gave her to me. So the words that came out of his mouth couldn't have been worse and couldn't have prescribed exile more perfectly. And so Aaron did it. I mean, yeah, it's horrible, 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 but Aaron did it right. I mean, by being paralyzed into silence. Maybe it was a malach sitting on his shoulder. We've just finished Megillat Esther, and there are those 5 places in Megillat Esther where the Malachei HaSharet helped her. If you're a midrashist, and one of them, clamped a hand over her, that she wouldn't curse Achashverosh, but that she would point her finger at Haman Hara Hazeh. And so maybe it was a malach sitting on Aaron's shoulder saying, shh, 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 shh. I mean, if there's a malach in every blade of grass telling it to grow, who's to say that there couldn't be a malach on Aaron's shoulder saying, shh, 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 shh.
Yeah.
So
I also think that
he did the right thing, and it could have been so explosive and wrong.
absolutely. I do just want to say to the malach point that this moment does feel like it's very consistent with Aaron's kind of primary character trait, which is this like people-pleasing character trait, mostly Latov and a little bit Lara and his involvement in the golden calf.
Very.
And then, but here also, in a sense, his like people-pleasing, I'm on public display, my relationship with Moshe and God lies in the balance. Like he was so maybe like extroverted or like outwardly focused that even in this moment of like intense grief, that characteristic, that midah of Aaron was at least loud enough to like equal it, I don't know, and push it into silence. Maybe you would say that characteristic is a malach or something like that, but
I like it. So you think it was volitional? You think it was something he, in an instant, when you have the choice to cry out, or you have the choice to vayidom, that you think it was some sort of instantaneous, it was volitional, or could have been, given his primary characteristic. It could have been, not now. This isn't the time and place. Shut your mouth.
Yeah, that's what I'm playing with, at least.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's just keep going in the fish vein. It's so good. So he says, prayer may also stand at this juncture of silence and speech. It may do so when one begins to articulate thanks or hope or prepares to recite a blessing and thereby affirm a theological dimension of the world. For immediately prior to the onset of prayer or blessing, the self may focus both mind and heart on the content of the words and their reference. This is a spiritually pregnant silence and gives birth to words framed by that silence and infused by it in every aspiration. Entering into articulation in this way is entering into a world brought to expression through language. I'm going to read that sentence again. Entering into articulation in this way is entering into a world brought to expression through language. The sounds of speech are meaningful only through the silences that precede them or carry them forward. Otherwise, they would only be din and noise. The emphasis on the idea that the world was created through speech and that speech is the correct balance between silence and noise, I think is a very beautiful idea. And therefore focusing on the same way that we talk about like the Torah being white fire, black fire on white fire, and you need the white fire also, that silence is like the verbal white fire. And it was an essential component in the creation of the world. We think about the world being created through speech, but when you recognize that silence was an essential component of speech, then the world was also created through silence, which I think is a really like magnificent read. And to take that understanding then both into tefillah, but in the context of what is happening for Aaron in this moment and what is his silence about, to see the silence actually as a creative silence, as a place where where worlds are brought into being, which I really think it is. I think this choice of our own, Sandra spelled it out better than I had previously today, of like what's the opposite, what would have happened if our own had gone the other way, which is what I would have done. I would have, my sons had just died, Moshe says that to me, I would have exploded. And our own didn't. And what that model sauce teaches about the potential of silence. And it's not that his silence is silent. His silence says so much. It says more than any words he might have chosen possibly could have said. And I think the fact that you can offer, and I think we've put out at least 4, maybe 5 different understandings of like what silence can be, what silence represents, that one person's silence can hold all of that different meaning in a way that words probably actually could not successfully have held. I think it's incredible, and it's a way in which silence is generative, and is creative, and also especially in grief, to have grief be expressed, taught, modeled through like almost through creative negation, is then also this very sort of beautiful or poetic idea. So I want to go back to Browning for a second here. Oh, we can just look quickly at this Gemara in Zmachim. It's just a very a very famous line. And so we have all these people, right? So Aaron is quiet, and David says Dom Hashem v'hit cholelo, and Shlomo says Eit lachashot v'eit ledaber, and Kohelet. And the Gemara then says Pamim sheshotik umekabel skar al hashtika, upamim medaber umekabel skar al hadibur. So we started out saying before that we live in a culture that's very into medaber umekabel skar al hadibur, like speak and you'll say the right words and people will hear, and if you're quiet, that's criminal. And remembering that pamim sheshotik umekabel skar al hashtika is in the same sentence, that there are times when you're silent and you receive reward for the silence. I think is also really important, that silence actually can speak, silence can model, silence can hold grief in a way that speech can't, is so important. And just to go back to the top now, sorry, that was probably a little dizzying. Elizabeth Barrett Browning is kind of skeptical about people who speak too much in grief. Like, I think what she's getting at here is that silence is a value in grief, especially because it doesn't ever turn into a statue. That it actually, when we're silent, we're able to grow, to change. Silence doesn't get you stuck, and your silence doesn't constitute a commitment to a particular meaning. It leaves open multiple meanings, which means that even if you're having these really difficult, really angry emotions, when you hold those emotions potentially with a certain amount of silence, then you over time don't stay committed to those emotions, and over time you can move past them, and eventually that statue that feels like I'm going to feel like this forever, it does eventually crumble. And that's where, if it could weep, it could arise and grow. And to like tie it back to the beginning, right? The passionless grief is the one that beats upwards to God's throne in loud access of shrieking and reproach. That's actually the passionless grief, even though what she's describing there is so familiar and such a familiar way of expressing grief, that like loud. And we have loud grief in our tradition too, by the way. Like, I can't not mention, right? We have the Mekunanot, we have Hasped, right? We have all kinds of articulation of grief. But I think what she is coming to say is like, there's a certain way in which that's like not the real thing. That's at least I think her argument. And that the type of grief that allows you to transform within it, that can contain lots of different shades of what grief can be, and that then allows you to be transformed within it and through it and come out the other way different, the same way that our Avelut has stages of silence. And that at the end of the day, by 30 days or by 12 months, you're able to return, you're able to say, like, yes, Shalom Aleichem to you and Aleichem Shalom. Like, I can receive your Shalom. I can be just like Shar B'nai Adam. I can be like other people. And that silence, I think Browning is arguing, silence is what enables us to go through that process and come out of it. Whereas if we've committed to my grief is going to only be expressed through anguish, through the midnight air, shrieking and reproach, then that's actually passionless in a certain way because it's not dynamic, versus the deep-hearted man who expresses grief for thy dead in silence like to death, that eventually it crumbles and moves and arises and goes. And that's something else that silence allows for us. Okay, so there's a lot that we just tried to cover, but hopefully really opening up the power of our own silence in our Parsha, and the power of silence as a kind of countercultural model that is really powerful, manifold, and dynamic in a way that speech can't be really. Hopefully gives us something to, I don't know, something to think about this week and probably many weeks into the future. So yeah, I'm going to stop sharing now, and if people have thoughts or comments, we have a couple minutes left.
Okay, I don't see any comments on Facebook. If anyone would like to unmute and say anything now, that's a good time. And if not, we can continue next time.
Thank you.
Sandra,
That was very absorbent.
Yes.
Really,
Leah?
thank you.
Just very, very, I agree. It's very, very powerful. And there are so many cultural, certainly from the Anglo-Saxon viewpoint, there are so many cultural norms that push one into speech. There's, on the one hand, silence is golden. On the other hand, silence is assent, which means silence is actual speech in some sort of quasi-legal sense. So I think what you said, Leah, is so true. This presented a counter-cultural model, and when we read Vayidom, I had a friend who lost a child, and I happened to meet this person on the day that I had studied Parashah in a Parashah class, and my friend said to me, "Okay, so you had Shemini today. So what did it say about Vayidom Aharon?" And in a flash, I got it. She was basically saying, like, do we speak in our grief? Are we silent in our grief? Am I allowed to cry in my grief? And of course, I have no answer. I had to do it Vayidom Aharon, right? But this is something that's huge. And Leah, I have to say, it is countercultural. I mean, when people ask people to speak at a funeral for a loved one, whoa, how hard is that? And yet it's considered in an Anglo-Saxon kind of Judeo-Christian way. Okay, pull up, chagor et matnecha, pull up your pants, put on a good belt, and get up there and say what you have to say. And now I have to tell you that at this Parsha and your explication of it, it really puts it in a countercultural, maybe transgressive, I don't know, but certainly not the way I think we've been presented with. At least that's how I feel.
Sorry, I was muted. I said, yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
And also we talk about hesped as if it's something that like the mourner has to do.
Exactly.
And it's not really in our texts that way.
How can you even think?
Yeah.
Wow. I agree. I think it's very complicated.
very complicated.
I mean,
But
part
there
of
were times in Jewish history when the speakers at funerals were actually like professionals, and their job was to just get everyone to cry. And it wasn't like say something concretely beautiful, blah 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 about this person. It was like, let's just all be really sad together, and I'm a professional sadness facilitator, basically.
exactly. Not to be laughed at anymore.
Yeah, seriously.
Thank you so much. This was excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbanit Sarna, as always, and thank everyone who joined us today, not only here on Zoom, but also on Facebook. Just a couple of reminders that this Sunday, April 7th at 12 p.m. Eastern, we'll have the 25th Annual Rappaport Memorial Lecture. Rabbi Silber will be teaching on the topic of the Seder ritual and the formation of community. So I hope to see you there. You know where to sign up, rappaport.drisha.org. Also, a new class, Mishnah in Depth Nazir with Rabbi Wolfish, is starting this Sunday, April 7th. It's the continuation of Drisha's Mishnah in Depth series, following the Mishnah Yomi series. You can sign up for that as well, drisha.org/courses/Mishnah in Depth Nazir Sota. And next week in this class, discussion on the Parashah, we have Rabbi John Kelston again. I will be teaching. Okay, so I'm looking forward to seeing you then. Sandra, yeah.
I just wanted to extend a personal invitation to everyone to sign up and come to Sunday's lecture. Our family, together with Rabbi Silber, put this pre-Pesach lecture together 25 years ago, figuring, I don't know, we'll get 25 people, maybe they'll come learn a little bit about Pesach, and it turned into an amazing community when we had physical community, and now a Zoom community also, lecture series. So please come. There's always a lot going, but maybe you can also stick your earbuds in, and if you're marching or somewhere else also, we can partially for about 45 minutes or an hour, talk about Pesach. And of course, David opened the lecture series with the first lecture, and we've had an amazing array of people. And now everybody thought it was appropriate for David to be the 25th anniversary speaker. So it's very, to him, it's a dear topic to his heart, creating the community and what it means and how it does it. And is it enough just to sit silent at the Seder table, or is something else required of us? Please.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Glad you were here.
Thank you.
I invite everyone, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone soon. Lehitraot.